and I'm very happy to introduce Diana Jeffries. Diana facilitates workshops on trauma and healing for education, settlement, and health practitioners. And she's currently working at the Atira Women's Resource Society, where a lot of her work informs the workshops that she gives. She's written several curricula and resource guides, one of which we'll be centering our conversation around today. And she's received the BC TEAL Settlement Language Award for 2020 to produce this resource. And she hopes that this work will be useful as an addition to your LINC teacher toolkits.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. And I'm speaking to you from downtown Vancouver, where I position myself as also a settler, first generation immigrant to Canada. And I am very grateful for being able to present this workshop to you today on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, which is where I do this work from. As Julie mentioned, I'm presently working at Atira, which is a women's housing organization situated all over the Lower Mainland. And I'm working on a pilot there, doing a education program for women in second stage transition housing that have fled violence. So I'm no longer working directly with the immigrant community, although that does take up some aspects of the work that I do. And I'm not just working with adults anymore, but I'm also working with school-age children. So it's been a really interesting time for me to develop my own skills and broaden my own perspectives. And I think it plays well into this conversation that I hope that you will have with me around decolonization strategies, in particular when we are in English language classrooms. I'm really, I think, heartened and impressed that people are actually discussing some of the issues around decolonization strategies and Indigenous issues within the LINC classroom, because I think it's one of the big reasons why I wanted to write this resource in the first place.
Welcome back, everyone. Yeah, I joined an interesting conversation as well. Diana, do you want to debrief us on what your group was talking about?
Sure. Well, I just was on the last, just for a minute or so, but just around the issue of how do you position yourself in the classroom, and understanding that there can be various concepts or understanding of what it means to live here, or what is Canadian. That was a question that was asked of me when I was teaching in LINC. And one question I remember very clearly, which was one of the impetus to why I wrote this, was when somebody came up after class and said, how do you feel about all these immigrants coming to your country and with all their various religions and cultural practices and ethnicities, and does it not bother you as Canadian that you would feel that your culture is being sort of diluted within this kind of concept of immigration? And I thought it was an interesting question, because I don't really position myself particularly strongly as somebody who believes in this idea of nationhood. But I understand that people do. And also I myself am, my parents were immigrants themselves, but I am seen more as a Canadian, perhaps more so than other people from other countries. So what does it mean to be Canadian? And then really, you shouldn't be asking me that. You should probably be asking people from First Nations, Métis, or from Inuit cultures, how they really feel about the immigrants than the settlers that have come to Canada. That would be a more appropriate question, although I understood what he was getting at. So it was just interesting. So the idea of positioning yourself is kind of, it became kind of an important thing to sort of tease out.
Yeah, that's something that I think we could go into a little bit more. And there are just so many things that come up in this initial conversation that it's hard to navigate this, because there's so many interesting directions where we could go in the conversation. We talked about Pbla and right away, and how it's a challenge to to position yourself and do all of the sharing or trying to fairly represent or share issues that may not belong to us, or that we don't feel, you know, that we can be a spokesperson for. And then how do we balance that with doing task-based work? So that came up, and I'd like to come back to some of these things. But first, Diana, can you help position this resource for everyone? For example, can you tell us like just what it's like?
In the introduction of it, I really try to address some of the issues that you as instructors may have when you come to lesson planning on this resource, and how it is really incumbent upon you to really think about it in terms of how you are going to unpack all these really complicated issues that are in the minds of everybody these days, especially I think now within the political and social unrest that we're seeing that has been happening not only in the US, but also in Canada pre-COVID, and pipelines and land claim settlements and issues around the truth and reconciliation. So I wanted to, first of all, in the introduction, to really give you some things to think about around how it is that you can really create a trauma-informed practice in your lesson planning, how it is that you would like to position yourself in the classroom as somebody who is an immigrant themselves or from the settler community, to think about also that some of your students in the class may have very similar or shared experiences that Indigenous people within living in Canada have had experiences around human rights violations. They also may identify as Indigenous themselves. And then how is it that you're going to address these really complicated issues where you are not othering other people and saying, well, they're all this way and we are this way, or that like it's complicated. So I think it takes a lot of sort of self-reflection and thought, and that's what I start the resource with. And then there's 4 parts to it, which I've tried to make it as sort of practical and useful for you to use with activities and Pbla assessment tools and tasks that you will use. The first part is based around language for decolonization, and it sort of unpacks things like the Indian Act and some of the terminology like unceded, the difference between Indigenous, Aboriginal, Indian, and what's the language that we use today, knowing that that may change as a result of further discussion, further understanding of through the leadership of Indigenous peoples and the way that they want to be, they want some of these efforts that they are making to be addressed, and taking leadership from them around language use. So we can think back 10 years ago, Aboriginal was kind of a word that people use quite often, and now it is Indigenous, and we don't use Aboriginal. And sort of knowing that these kinds of discussions and changes within language are important, and they actually can help develop and propel societal change in really positive ways. The second part is on land acknowledgements that students will be able to use, and that because they will hear or read in community gatherings, at art institutions, they often will use or say their land acknowledgements for the unceded territory that they're living on. And with that is a task where they will then present a land acknowledgement for their own, for where it is that they live, understanding what unceded means, unceded being stolen land, and really making sure that they are not just using this language in rote, which is, you know, often I think being the case where many sort of institutions and organizations, like at universities or community events, where they just kind of roll it off their tongue, but it doesn't kind of mean anything. So trying to create that meaningful understanding and acknowledgement that you are on Indigenous land. And then also that sort of discovery about the Indigenous nation that you may live on, and what is that nation, and what are there some of their cultural practices that they use that you may not, your students may not know about, and what are the sort of geographic locations, and what kind of land claims that they have, and what is their self-governing obligations that they have, how much are they in control of their education systems, etc. And the third one, it gets into the more heavier pieces around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Truth and Trauma is what it's called in the third part, and it's really looking at residential schools and child apprehension programs that have been across Canada historically, and what are the effects of residential schools that have had serious transgenerational trauma on Indigenous peoples, and also looking at how that trauma continues today, and also looking at how it is that you as instructors will need to make sure that you have a trauma-informed classroom to be able to address some of these issues before sort of throwing it out there and saying, okay, now we're going to talk about residential schools today, but really giving some thought to how it is that you can unpack that very disturbing and that history of the federal government and settler institutions and churches that were to blame for those injustices. And then with that being that so many people may have had those very similar forced migration experiences within their own context, and as refugees, certainly people who may identify themselves as Indigenous from other parts of the world, that will have had shared experience. And so it's really important to have a trauma-informed practice before going into discussing any of the lessons and the activities that you do in that unit. And the last one is a little bit more upbeat and hopeful, where it is looking at the Indigenous resilience and survival, because as much as assimilation was a federal policy for trying to destroy the Indigenous cultures across Canada, the Indigenous, the Métis, and the Inuit cultures, they have survived. And it is because of that incredible resilience that still exists today, that that survival has really become a kind of act of spiritual renewal for a lot of Indigenous people. And they also are very much interested, as far as my own research goes, in sharing some of those cultural practices with the wider community. And I think this could be something that's really interesting for newcomers, particularly people who have had trauma through their migration experience to Canada. So looking at things like the medicine wheel, and some of those self-care strategies that incorporate how life is made up of these four parts of the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional parts of our lives, and how is that from a cultural perspective of Indigenous peoples, but also how that can be shared within the wider community for wellness and self-care that we all could use. So that's basically the resource. Within that, there's a number of activities that can be used, and within that there's Pbla tasks and tools that you can also use and grade according to the level. I have put this at a CLB 5+, but I think you could use it for lower levels and higher levels with a bit of adjusting to the materials that I've provided, and maybe looking at the CLB. The CLBs to think about the Pbla holistic and analytic points that you want to assess for each student. I think that when I was thinking about writing this, I was thinking, okay, well, this could be used within the theme of Canada, for certainly for higher levels, where they have been sort of, talking about citizenship and Canadian culture, society, political structures, etc., perhaps in lower levels. But this would be a really good opportunity to talk about some of the issues and the sort of complex relationships that Indigenous people have within Canada and how they identify themselves, not as Canadian necessarily. Some may and some don't, but just that even the words like Indigenous people of Canada as opposed to Indigenous people in Canada is important for a lot of Indigenous communities. And also, but just to say that it doesn't necessarily have to fall into those themes of Canada, and it can be used throughout whatever theme that you are on. So if it's health, looking at some of the healing practices that Indigenous people use. There's also within that unit a healing circle workshop that can be organized within the organization that you're working with, and I have suggested that maybe it could be shared with other classes and other departments of your of your organization. So it's like managers and teachers and students and maybe the coordinator and maybe the volunteer coordinator and a settlement worker, and all sorts of people can be involved in those kinds of conversations and really learn about what are the Indigenous healing practices from practitioners that have this healing workshop, healing circle workshop that they provide to the health sector, to the education sector. And when I met with them, they had not ever done anything for newcomers. And so I was like, you've got to get on it. Like, this is a really important piece because these are the new people that are coming to Canada. These are the people that you want to address because so that they don't fall into the same pitfalls that settler communities have fallen into in terms of othering Indigenous people or seeing them as or just having the wrong references or the wrong ways of talking about Indigenous people. It's better if we can connect with Indigenous communities directly, especially within the therapeutic sector, like the health and education sectors where this workshop is coming from. Mm-hmm. So that's in the resource as well with connections that you can make directly.
And is there any section in the resource, Diana, that includes information on how to contact and communicate with elders? Because yeah. I know that you're not supposed to ask them how much the honoraria should be, etc., things like that. Is there support for that too?
There's not directly, but I have made the connection on your behalf, so they know that you will be I'm hoping that you will be contacting them and reaching out to discuss things like honorariums or what is it that they charge. They will tell you depending on what it is that you need. It's often not cheap, but it's well worth the expense that you can perhaps share, and I've suggested that you share it with other departments within your organization. I think it's just such a great opportunity for people to learn about Indigenous healing practices, especially on the West Coast. They may, because that's where we're living, or within the community that where you are within BC, because they're unique and different. And I think that they also, some of your students may share some of those same practices within their own Indigenous cultures, like from the Latin American community, for example, for you. But I think there's, I understand the real world tasks that you're trying to create that are very much sort of addressing the immediate needs of your students. And you might see this as like, what's the balance between knowledge, like language knowledge, language acquisition, and then information, and then not falling into that trap, which many of us do, where we're talking about a really big issue, maybe in the news or whatever, and then it becomes this discussion that's nothing to do with language, but it is a really interesting discussion and people are into it. So I think you just, it's helpful if you can try and find that balance, but bringing it back to what is the language outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And Pbla is really very good at making sure that you address that directly. So the Pbla tasks that I've put in there are things like creating a really personal presentation with a land acknowledgement, or doing a project around a research project on the Indigenous community that you live in. There's reading, sharing information around the residential school system and the 60 Scoop. There's interesting stories on women in Indigenous leadership and matriarchal societies, for example. And these kinds of things are not exactly, you know, going to the bank and opening a bank account. We know those things are really important for newcomers, but this is also important. And I think that we can do both. So the language is coming out of a really interesting and dynamic and ever-changing discussion around decolonization strategies. But that's also part of having conversations within Canada and listening and reading the news, for example, and learning about what's happening around environmental changes, for example, where Indigenous peoples across Canada are very much at the forefront of those kinds of changes. Talking about land acquisition or taxation and things like how systems work within Canada. And it's important to understand what that means also for the Indigenous community. And there is that, reading the maps, reading where residential schools were within British Columbia, what are the nations in British Columbia, what are the languages in British Columbia. So it's regional in terms of it being from BC, but it's also really taking a wider understanding of who is living here in Indigenous life within British Columbia. But then looking at it around things like the Indian Act, which has some aspects that are not dissimilar to the experience of newcomers, where they have certain ID status versus non-status. These are experiences that newcomers have, whether they're asking for refugee status, for example, and Indigenous people also asking for Indigenous status. These are things through the Indian Act, which is extremely paternalistic and problematic for most Indigenous people. And what is the strategies that Indigenous leaders are taking to erode some of those practices from a federal government perspective? If you're doing the theme of education this month, for example, there's the Orange Shirt Day, which is on September 30th, which is an acknowledgement of the residential school system and the harm to Indigenous peoples across Canada. That would be a good, there's a piece in the guide, or in the resource on residential schools. I just urge you to make sure that your students are well prepared to hear or to read about these traumatic experiences. There's a couple of really good stories told by elders on their experiences, and there's readings as well. But just to make sure that you prepare students before talking about it and making sure that your classroom is a safe space for them to learn about these injustices and human rights violations that happened within Canada. When I was a LINC instructor myself, although I taught very low levels, I mean, it was something that I would talk about Canada, and I felt like, okay, there's this whole part of this topic that I found very difficult to find resources on, particularly for lower levels, but even for higher levels. The materials that was provided by such things as the TRC were great, but they were, the language was quite academic and hard for anybody who is like in a LINC program. It would be hard, and then it would therefore be required of the teacher to create a lot of their own materials. So this is why I thought, okay, this is something that you can pull from the shelf and pull out and use a few of these activities, either within the whole theme of Canada and just forget talking about Canada itself if you're at a higher level, because if they've gone through the LINC program, they've heard it all before. So this is kind of a new take, and just looking at it from a decolonization and Indigenous perspective could be quite interesting for students. But also you could intercept some of these activities throughout, like I said, through the health and wellness, through education, through creating this trauma-informed practice. It kind of tries to hit on a few of these themes. And the other thing was that, you know, I also don't know. I grew up in Canada. My parents were immigrants themselves, but I also don't have a really good understanding of Indigenous societies. And I was curious in how to figure that out. And what was also interesting is because now I'm working with the TEAL, and I do work with a lot of Indigenous women. And a colleague of mine she's from Niska up in village just outside of Terrace, and she was telling me how she remembers when she came down to Vancouver to go to nursing school, and she was like considered the example of all Indigenous people, and whenever there was a question about Indigenous culture, she was expected to answer it. And so for her, that was incredibly difficult, because she was like, I'm from a small village up in the, in the Kootenays. I don't know everything. I don't know what's going on with the Algonquin people or the Mohawk or wherever. I mean, it's just our own level of ignorance and our racist education that we have all been brought up in, to try and right some of those things and try and come at it from a more understanding the relationship Indigenous people have with Canada, and understanding the real complexities of trying to unpack all this. So this is just a start, and I'm very hopeful that other people will also contribute and add resources as I have done, because I'm really coming at it from a very, I don't know, I'm just going to try this and see what happens.
Open place, right? Yeah, and you've expressed to me, Diana, that you're open to also kind of having it as a live document where others are able to submit resources that work for them as well, right?
Yeah. And I think that there's opportunities to develop new materials for LINC, specifically for LINC, with Pbla that can address some of these.
One of the things that I did in my master's studies was look at how to choose and use Indigenous films, so that the films could speak for the issues of different mosaics of Indigenous peoples across Canada. And so I've created this resource that complements what Diana's got, and she also has a lot of great resources in there as well when it becomes available. But it is a website called Choosing and Using Indigenous Film Resources, and there are plenty of links to short films in here that everybody can access, as well as some extracurricular supports. I have a place for yours right here, Diana, when it's ready. Indigenous Peoples in Canada, LINC 5+ Guide. I'll put the title in there. But there's just so much here, and I think film is a really great way if you're not feeling comfortable yet, or you just don't feel that you have the whole scope of an issue. Why not let the filmmaker tell their own story by showing their film? But I think positioning yourself before you do any of this kind of thing is important. Can you just say why you think positioning yourself is important, Diana?
I think because it's also just because people don't really know where you are coming from exactly, like who you are within the context of Canada. And I think it's helpful because people are very confused about what being Canadian often is. And I'm like, I don't know myself. Like, I don't have a very strong sense of what being Canadian is, but I think that is a really positive thing. I think that maybe people feel somewhat less secure in that and having like an existential experience or a crisis because of that, like lack of identity. But I think it's also a really, really important piece when you're living on colonized land, to make sure that you do position yourself and say, well, I do come from a new immigrant family, or I do come from a settler culture, and I am not representative of Canada just because I am white. I don't see that. So, but maybe other people do, and maybe it's regional as well, where people, in central Canada might feel more of a sense of what it means to be Canadian in that context, in the settler context. But then what does it mean for Indigenous people, and how do they see Canada? They do not see it as this benevolent, safe land. They see it as a dangerous, scary place. Varied. Indigenous culture is extremely varied, and there's many people who have experiences of trauma that have affected their lives because of their experiences of colonization. But there's also people, their resilience it's something to be so impressed by, and through doing the research that I have done and just looking at the efforts that on a national scale of trying to assimilate Indigenous people, and they have survived that, is something to really, really honor and respect and celebrate, because it's kind of amazing that they still are so steadfast and strong within their culture and values and attitudes and land stewardship. It's not what we all think, that they have these abilities to contribute to the betterment of all of us. And I think that's a really important part to bring to the conversation, not to see it as, again, they're only victims, but they are also incredible leaders and incredible thinkers that we all can learn from.
What is trauma-informed teaching, and how can we incorporate that?
Yeah, I think that for me, trauma-informed really means to take a respectful approach of where people are at emotionally and mentally in terms of the LINC program, within their migration experience, coming to Canada, and perhaps the trauma that they have experienced within Canada, whether it be through prejudice, racism, just even language barriers can be really traumatic. Some of the, issues around housing, etc. These kinds of things can also, the settlement process in and of itself can be a really traumatic experience, let alone what they've experienced in their past through war or just human rights violations, etc. So with that in mind, I think it's important to create a really, really strong relationship with students and the teacher, to make sure that students feel really safe in a safe space. And that means some practical things like making sure that doors and windows are open so that people feel like there's an opportunity to leave if they need to, and allowing that to happen, to having a safe, quiet space for somebody who needs to step out to calm themselves, to give opportunities for breaks when they need it, to decide on how students can regain a sense of control within their classroom and their learning. How is it that you can help to facilitate connections between students and between yourself? I know that for me, my whole summer of working with women who have experienced a lot of violence and their children, has been to really not focus at all on academics, but really just me building a trusting relationship, which takes a long time for people who have experienced a lot of trauma. So I have just worked on that, on building relationships, a really meaningful, important, like meaningful individual relationships with the students that I work with. And so I think sometimes we can be very rigorous in our approach towards Pbla, etc., which is important, but it's also important for those students who are struggling emotionally, mentally, spiritually, to be able to address their issues in the context of a LINC classroom as well, because it's a good place where they can get support from you and from other students. So providing that safe space is what I mean by trauma informed. Being culturally humble in your approach, not telling people how it is, allowing people to have a voice, allowing people to make decisions for themselves, and just be unequivocal in your support for them and your emotional trust that you can provide for them. So I think that is very difficult to learn from people that you don't like or that you don't love. So that's certainly, and that's very true in my work with Indigenous peoples. How is it that I can make sure that I, as from a white, very, very privileged perspective, can make sure that I am also meeting them at a place that they feel that they can trust me, because even with my own privilege and ethnicity. So that's what I mean by being trauma informed. It's really about building those really important relationships. Yeah, being trauma informed is really like making sure that you're committed to the work that you're doing, knowing that it's community work. It is language, but it's also not, it's also language for people that have not necessarily chosen to come here. And so that they are perhaps through their experiences, and perhaps not, you never know where trauma comes up for people, but just that you are aware that people in your classrooms will have had experiences of trauma that may show up and may get triggered within the classroom, and how you address it, how you approach it, how you pay respect to that is really, really a key part of your teaching work. So I had an advisory committee from it's hard to say, it means butterfly, but it's Hulela Kuelum community, which is an Indigenous health organization on the Downtown East Side that works and is run by Indigenous elders within the community. So they were advising me along with various academics and researchers that I was looking at that are also listed in the resource itself. But it was this kind of balance between, okay, language and Indigenous issues, right? Like it is a resource for the LINC program. So as in, they were my advisory, but it was also like I needed to fit it into a Pbla kind of LINC perspective. So, but they have looked at the finished resource and have approved it. So that's been helpful. And they're the ones that will also come and do the healing circles if people are interested. As I said to the other group, this healing circle is one, they're all Indigenous, 3 women, 2 being therapists, counselors, and the other one being an academic from UBC. So.
And about the healing circle, Fiona asked, how do we navigate introducing something like a talking circle or healing circle without getting it wrong or being reductive? Should we, I mean, yes, there's the film, but if you can't bring in the support Indigenous guest to your classroom, is it safe to do that?
I don't know. I'm not sure. Does anybody else have anything? I'm not sure if I would.
I personally wouldn't do that, but because I don't know, I haven't been taught that culture, that piece. So I personally wouldn't do that, but I would show a film about it.
Yeah, I think that's the better way to go. I think it's an awesome opportunity if you can afford it, if your organization can afford it, to do that. But
the Kairos blanket exercise is also a great tool, but it's quite expensive.
Yeah.
So again, it would have to probably be very like organization-wide type of event. And now that we have Zoom,
you can advocate, right? Like you can advocate, like get other departments within the settlement sector to contribute. I mean, I don't know. There's ways of doing it. I think that can be really useful. You could have a really big healing circle. Like, that could be cool, right? Mm-hmm. And not just have students, but have practitioners and teachers and settlement workers, and building that community, right?
Yeah. Do you feel it's harmful to discuss Canadian history or culture in a simplified way for lower levels if it means neglecting to point out how complicated and unfortunate the truth actually is? Let's say if you're, putting something in for Thanksgiving or Canada Day. What do you think about that?
I actually think that it's not like I would be specific about what I'm talking about. So if I'm talking about Thanksgiving, I would say, well, a lot of people don't see Thanksgiving as kind of not a time of celebration, but harvest is a time of celebration. But the idea of Thanksgiving and sharing with Indigenous peoples was not like a point of great happiness for many Indigenous cultures. So I think that just pointing out the complicated relationship of these cultural practices that we have it can be done with lower levels, but I wouldn't go lower than a CLB2, to be honest. I think it would just be like, what kind of thing? It would just kind of be hard to really understand the concepts. But I think that you can bring up how things are challenging within Canada and the efforts that are being made to decolonize this part of the world from the efforts of Indigenous people, if you bring up very specific examples.
And a huge thank you to you, Diana Jeffries. Applause. Thanks for all your contributions to the
thank you,
course.
everybody. That was great.
It's a lot of work you put into it, and the link will be shared with you all through BC TEAL. So thank you very much for putting in all that effort, Diana. It's going to be a resource that we use for many years to come, I think.
And hopefully you may all start to contribute and add on to it, because there's always that. I just started something, but hopefully it will continue.